This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Jennifer Harris disappeared from Bonham, Texas on Mother's Day 2002. The secrets in the Jennifer Harris case have been hidden for 20 years.
When someone disappears, you have to look at who would benefit from their disappearance.
What happened to Jennifer Harris, and who is responsible for her death? Coming May 10th, Final Days on Earth, Season 2, The Life and Death of Jennifer Harris. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are The Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our look at the Daniel Robinson case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my unequaled co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett. I don't know if that's true. Tonight, I am feeling so tired. We know what, though? We've been having a great time because we've been chatting now for almost an hour and a half. I don't even know what we've been talking about, but I looked down at the clock and I'm thinking, that's a good time. That's a good time when you've been talking to someone for that long. You have no idea what we've been talking about.
If we'd been recording this whole time, we'd already be done with this episode.
You would think.
You would. Okay.
But you know what? Back to your unequal superlative. Maybe we're not that good at math right now.
That's a good point. I don't know. I just think one of our underappreciated skills is recording podcasts late at night when we're both very tired. I don't know. I think it's like some sort of weird...
It's like I come alive.
There you go. It's like you come alive.
You know what I did last night? I mean, I know you did because I was texting you and your wife and you were asleep. I stayed up and watched the total lunar eclipse, and it was awesome. It was awesome because it was late at night. It was midnight, and I walked out into the middle of my street, and there were no cars, and no one was awake. And it just felt like, Like I was all alone in a good way, though. So I kind of love the nighttime. It's so quiet.
Sounds like
and
a good
peaceful.
way to get murdered.
That's why I texted y'all, because if I was found murdered in the middle of the street, my tox report was going to come back 0. Like I had nothing in my system, and they're going to be like, why did she leave her sleeping husband and sleeping children behind, locked the door, left her keys and phone at home, and was found just feet away from her house? Then y'all would know. Total lunar eclipse.
Yeah, it would have been a great mystery.
It was definitely some lights in the sky. That one was just for you, Brett, for Dyatlov Pass.
Yes, well, we have another mystery, a real mystery, that we're still working on today, in the case of Daniel Robinson. I think if you guys listened to our last podcast, you understand why this is both a really important and a really confusing case. And I got to tell you, as we dive deeper into the details, it is only going to get more confusing. I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to think about this, and I look forward, particularly after we get through some of the things we're going to talk about today. I think there's going to be a lot of good discussion about this case.
Absolutely. So let's just dive in, Brett, because we've already talked about the timeline. We've talked about some of the very strange things in this case already. And now let's talk about the inside of Daniel's car. Inside and around the vehicle, police found Daniel's phone, work computer, personal computer, wallet, keys, and, strangely, the clothes he'd been wearing when he went missing. Scattered up the side of the hill were 2 socks, 2 boots, jeans, shorts, shirt, and an orange reflective vest that we talked about that you can see in the picture in last week's episode. No blood was found in the vehicle, and Daniel had been wearing his seatbelt when the crash occurred. The airbags were deployed. The passenger side seatbelt was unbuckled at the time of the crash, which could indicate that no one was sitting there, that he was alone. We don't know that for a fact, of course, because we just have the black box, which tells us things like speed when things are deployed, if something is buckled. But I think that's incredibly interesting. So it looks like all of his clothes are gone. We don't know everything he was wearing, but it looks like all clothes are gone except for his underwear. But there's no sign of Daniel whatsoever.
And this has echoes of the Jason Landry case, which we talked about, which is another case where you have a young man who has an accident on the side of the road, and then you find his clothes in the middle of the road, and you're trying to figure out exactly what happened there. In that case, we speculated that there might have been some sort of head injury involved, and that combined with a very cold night and something called paradoxical undressing could have led Jason to strip himself of his clothes. In this case, you have the accident. There could have been a head injury. There's not the cold. That's not really an issue. In fact, it's going to be very hot around when Daniel disappears. The head injury is a possibility. There's no blood. The airbags did deploy, but as many people know, airbags can do a lot of things, but especially in a wreck like this, you have, and we're going to talk more about the accident here in a second, but those of you who've seen the photo, the car is laying on its side. This would have been a pretty bad wreck. I think that's one reason we can be pretty sure that there was no one in that passenger seat. Not wearing your seatbelt in a wreck like this, even if you survived it, I think there would have been some blood. So the fact that there's no blood, I think, supports the idea that Daniel was alone when this happened. But I think this was a pretty bad wreck. So it is certainly possible that this is the result of a head injury. Now, it is still very strange. It's a very strange thing to see. And even if you look at the photo, you can see these clothes, particularly the orange reflective vest. And then Daniel left basically everything else in his car. And already when you hear that, the list of possibilities here begins to narrow. This is a missing persons case, so of course people always think maybe he ran off to start a new life. Well, not likely with no clothes and no wallet. That just seems like a strange way, if you wanted to start a new life, to do so.
And it's interesting because things like the computers, not just one, but two computers, and the phone and the wallet are things that if you had a looter come by or someone who wanted to rob him in advance of the crash or just come by after and had ill will for him, even though he had nothing to do with the crash, these are easy targets to take. Yet after all of this time, remember, they didn't find his car until about a month later. Those kind of valuable items are still there. And that just may be that, it indicates that there was no robbery ahead of time. Now, let's talk about Daniel's phone. This is really interesting. Daniel's phone, as we said, it was left behind in the car. He did not take it with him, but it had been wiped. It contained no map data, no text messages, nothing save for the contacts on the phone. It's unclear precisely when the phone was wiped. All we know was that it appears it's been wiped except for the contacts that he had. And based on kind of his communications with people, the way he texted and also called people, we have reason to believe that had his phone not been wiped, there would be those sorts of information and that sort of data on the phone. He wasn't someone who didn't use his phone, in other words.
And we're going to talk about, and have already talked about a little bit when we're going through the timeline, sort of the path that he took that day. And as we've said 1,000 times, if you have someone's phone and they have it on them, it's pretty easy to figure out where all they've traveled because your phone is constantly spying on you. One thing we talked to Daniel's dad, and I'm very curious to know when the phone was wiped. And it was one of the things he was going to look into to see if they could find out. And I think that's a critical question about when that happened. That would be such a big part of the timeline because you don't imagine that someone gets into a car wreck like this, has a potential brain injury, and then gets their phone out and wipes it. That just doesn't really make a lot of sense. On the other hand, if they wiped it beforehand, you would expect that the most recent data would still be there. You would still have the data between, say he wiped it the day before. Well, you'd have the data for that day, which is what we'd like to see. But apparently that is just gone. And that is a strange thing. It is a very, very strange fact about this case. I don't know if it's possible that the phone was damaged in some way that made it appear as though it was wiped, but in reality it was just the memory was damaged. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems as though this phone was essentially, everything on it was deleted. Why that happened? Hard to say. The Prosecutors is sponsored by BetterHelp, and our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/prosecutors. Alice, it's a rough time for everybody. There's a lot going on, and it feels like it's been this way for years now. People feel burned out. I know it may seem strange. We've been out of the office for so long because of the pandemic, and yet you just feel like you can barely get up in the morning. I know that's how I feel, and there are times when it can be overwhelming, and people are burned out without even knowing it. And symptoms can include lack of motivation, irritability, fatigue, and more. And if that's something that reminds you of things that you're going through, BetterHelp Online Therapy wants to remind you to prioritize yourself. Talking with someone can help you figure out what's causing stress in your life.
Brett, you're so right. With full-time jobs and podcasting and trying to keep up with our families and our young children, sometimes it feels like too much. And there is no shame whatsoever to reach out and get some help, especially through BetterHelp. Therapy is for everyone. You can pick and choose when you want to do it or do it regularly for maintenance. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/prosecutors. That's betterhelp.com/prosecutors. Brett, we've got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode, The Jordan Harbinger Show, a podcast you should definitely check out since you all are fans of high-quality, fascinating podcasts sponsored by interesting people. The show covers such a wide range of topics through weekly interviews with heavy-hitting guests, and there are a ton of episodes you'll find interesting since you're a fan of our show. For example, you can go listen about how kidnap insurance works, and you can hear from Anja Shortland, who is a professor of political economy who specializes in the economics of crime. And there are so many other episodes that I think you'll love.
Yeah, Alice, there's an episode for everyone, no matter what you're into. The show covers stories like how a professional art forger somehow made millions of dollars while being chased by the feds and the mafia. The podcast covers a lot, but one constant is Jordan's ability to pull useful pieces of advice from his guests. I promise you'll find something useful that you can apply to your own life, whether it's an actionable routine change that boosts your productivity or just a slight mindset tweak that changes how you see the world. We really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy.
All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Are you looking for a new job or want a career change? Look no further than Monster.com. Need a little help standing out? Our expert resume writing services will make sure you shine. Want to brush up on your interview skills? Engage with our AI interview prep tool. Want some advice on negotiating your new salary? Visit our salary tools and extensive library of career advice articles, and you'll have all the tips and tricks you'll need to succeed. Visit Monster.com today and take the first step towards your career. Monster.com. Find your right job fit.
So we talked about the crash a little bit. Let's go into more depth on that. So an accident reconstruction was done on the vehicle. Given its location and the damage that it suffered, the vehicle appears to have sped up considerably before it crashed into the side of the ravine. When the airbags deployed, it was traveling around 30 miles per hour. The brakes were never applied. Rather than a purposeful attempt to wreck the vehicle, authorities theorized that Daniel was attempting to climb the embankment. And when you see the photo, you will understand why you might think that. As we said last time, this is not a deep ravine. This is not the Grand Canyon. It's not a canyon of any kind. It's basically just a ditch. And so you can sort of imagine someone, in order to get up the embankment, they're going to go as fast as they can. They're not going to apply the brakes. Still a weird thing to do and a dangerous thing to do. And in this case, essentially just leads to whoever's in that car, if this is what happened, hitting the side of this embankment at 30 miles an hour without even putting the brakes on. When the car was found, it was laying on its passenger side. The driver's side window was broken out. It was essentially in one piece. So the driver's side is broken out, the car door is closed, it's in one piece. It's possible whoever got out of the car actually climbed through that open window. Now, one of the most interesting things that the car's black box revealed is that following this wreck, data indicated that someone attempted to start the car at least 40 times.
Brett, that's a lot of times. That's a lot.
That is a lot of times.
That's a lot of times, especially when put into the perspective. I think it's so interesting that right before the crash, brakes were not applied. 30 miles per hour, you're thinking about driving on like in a school zone. It's not that fast, except when you know you're about to hit someone. 30 miles per hour is very fast if you're going to hit, say, a standing wall or a ravine. And usually our instinct, at least my instinct, hits whenever I think the car in front of me is stopping too quickly or I see something pop out that I wasn't expecting. My foot automatically goes to the brake, probably more often than it really is needed to. And so the fact that this car was traveling at 30 miles per hour with no brakes ever applied indicates to me that whatever happened may have happened too fast for Daniel to even have reacted to reflexively hit the brakes, or that he never intended to hit the brakes, like he was, for whatever reason, this was his plan and he knew exactly what he was going to do and he did not hit the brakes on purpose, or some other thing. But it just seems like there has to be, it seems like when you know you're going to hit something going 30 miles per hour, instinct can take over unless you have your mind made up you're not going to hit the brakes.
30 miles per hour might seem slow on a surface road, on a paved road, but remember, Daniel's out in the middle of the desert. He's going 30 miles an hour over bumps, unpaved area, brush, all sorts of things, right? And when you're driving 30 miles per hour in that sort of circumstance, it feels a lot faster. And I don't know, it's a strange thing. You can sort of understand this whole notion that you just got to go to get up that ravine, and it just didn't work out. But it is striking that someone would do that. For whatever reason, it is striking that someone would do that. Then you have the fact the car was attempted to be started 40 times. So basically, every time you get into your car and you turn the key, it goes to those first levels. When you initially turn it on, even if you haven't cranked the car yet, the radio comes on, the air comes on. That is the sort of electrical system turning on. When that happens, it records as an ignition attempt in this way. Even if you didn't then attempt to actually crank the car, that would count as one. And you may ask yourself, well, is 40 a lot? Remember Maura Murray. Go all the way back to Maura Murray. After the wreck, the Maura Murray wreck, her car there was an attempt to restart the car in this way about 7 times. 7 is the number that sticks out in my head. It's less than 10. So whoever did that would have cycled through the ignition 7 times. Remember, her car was found on the side of the road, not in a ditch. If it was drivable, you could have driven away. And that car, you could think somebody who just got in a wreck, maybe they try and start their car, it won't start. And so at that point, whatever happens, happens. And you think, oh, you tried a couple times. If you try it too many times, the battery's going to run dead if the car doesn't turn on. In this case, you've got 40 times. And remember, the car, the SUV, is laying on its side, on the passenger side. So if you're in that car laying on the passenger side, the thought that you would be like, oh, well, I should try and start the car. Maybe I can drive away. Maybe that's more evidence that whoever was driving had some sort of head injury, because it certainly makes absolutely no sense. Now, it is certainly the case that some of those could have been related to the police investigation, the tow recovery. You could imagine tow truck driver tries to turn the car on or just puts it in sort of those first stages of ignition so maybe he can change the gear, maybe so he can put the car in neutral, something like that. The police have to turn the car on so they can get the information from the black box. Assume 10 times they did this. That still leaves you 30 times that someone would have attempted I mean, I say to restart the vehicle, that's probably assuming too much, but would have put that key in the ignition and turned that key for some purpose.
Yeah, that really strikes me, Brett, because in Maura Murray, her car was at least on 4 tires on the ground. But for the damage initially, you can still conceivably physically drive it away, physics-wise. Here, the car is very obviously on its side. There's no way that even if you could start the car would move forward because all 4 wheels are kind of off the ground or maybe 2 are touching, tangentially on the ground. But if the wheels, if the gas was hit, you could somehow turn on the car, the wheels would just spin. And you would think if you were actually trying to get it to move, you would do something like, I don't know, push the car over, try to leverage it so that it's on right side up, 4 wheels touching the ground, and then try to start it. But obviously the car was found still on its side. So it's not clear exactly what the purpose is even of trying to start the car or to turn the key in the ignition. And the other thing that strikes me is 40 times is, let's give the benefit of the doubt and knock down 10 for police or tow trucks trying to
give them 20.
Give them 20. 20, it takes some time, right? It's not a couple seconds. It's a while. It's at least really 20 seconds. It's about a minute of sitting there and kind of doing the same thing over and over. And that's very interesting because at some point, it's either frustration or an inability to grasp the situation to continue to do the same thing without a different outcome over and over again.
Yeah, it's very strange. However many times it happened, however many times can't be attributed to the police. I mean, say they did it 30 times, they did it 35 times. Any number of times laying on the side there that someone tried to use the key to turn on that car is one too many. It's just, I can't, it's hard to really conceptualize that. But it seems like it happened a lot. Now, the interesting thing is that's not the only anomaly. There's another anomaly that goes along with that, and that is that there is a discrepancy between the mileage that is registered on the computer and what is on the odometer. And it's a discrepancy of 11 miles, which indicates that at least as far as the computer is concerned, the car after the wreck then traveled an additional 11 miles. Now, I think the initial thought is this must be some sort of glitch. Obviously, the car is laying on its side. If it's been in this kind of wreck, it's not going to move 11 miles after it crashed. And the police have said that they think this is just a glitch. This is some sort of weird thing that's happened, and it's actually not significant.
Can you explain that to me? So does the computer, I guess, which one registers what? If your tires are moving, I guess that moves the odometer, but the computer only captures what the car is running? Or is it the other way around? I'm trying to understand how the discrepancy comes about.
Honestly, I don't understand exactly how the discrepancy comes about. The only thing I know for sure is that if you look at the information that you're getting from the car, you have a mileage reading of when this accident supposedly occurred. So, remember, you've got when the airbags deploy, you know the mileage that happens. With this kind of car, with this kind of black box, they actually can get a lot of information out of that. And so that's one of them. So you know essentially what the mileage was for the car when this accident occurred. Somehow, after that happened, there is an additional 11 miles that is registered on the vehicle. So I'm not entirely sure how that happened, and nobody really is. The police position is it's some sort of glitch. It doesn't really mean that the car traveled an additional 11 miles. It's just nothing. It's a red herring, essentially. But how all that happened is kind of a mystery.
Yeah, I mean, Occam's razor really is that it's a technical glitch, right? That somehow maybe at the beginning the computer was already off by 11 miles and you would never know that because you only see your odometer, for example. So how would you check that the computer was off? But it certainly is strange. Here's the thing. There are some, however, who find that maybe this, the things we've been trying to explain away as just a glitch or just something strange, just the police starting the car 35 to 40 times. There are some who think that all of these factors point to something much more nefarious. Daniel's family hired a private investigator, and he looked back at the black box information. He argues that the wreck was earlier and that this accident was merely a cover-up. First, both the investigator and Daniel's father have tried to get a vehicle up to the speed that police say Daniel was traveling at the time of the wreck. But because of the terrain, they were unable to even get close to that speed. So the investigator, who is a trained accident reconstructionist, believes what was more likely was that the car was actually coming down into the ravine from above. So the opposite of what the police hypothesize. It's unusual that there are no tracks leading to the wreck site. And although the police argue that the seasonal rains would have been responsible, those who know the area are adamant that the tracks would have survived any kind of weather. Now, according to his analysis of the black box, the accident occurred 4 hours after Daniel was last seen. Obviously, it did not take Daniel 4 hours to drive the 2 miles to where the vehicle was ultimately found. So, what was Daniel doing during that time, and where did he go? The investigator also points to the additional 11 miles that appears the car traveled after it was wrecked. If this is not a glitch, it's possible that the area where Daniel's vehicle was found was not the site of the initial wreck. That's really interesting, Brett, to consider that there was a wreck, but not where we found the car. And there's additional evidence to support this theory. There is evidence of red paint on the car that does not match anything in the area of the wreck and is clearly the result of transfer. So, could Daniel have gotten in an accident with another vehicle earlier in the day? And finally, there's the ignitions. The car was found laying on its side. Even if Daniel was not thinking clearly, attempting to restart his car dozens of times, as we've already discussed, just seems incredibly strange.
Now, look, this feels very conspiratorial, right? I mean, normally this is the kind of thing that we would very quickly dismiss. We've done it in a lot of cases. But the difference between this case and, say, Maura Murray's case or Jason Landry's case, in those cases, there's no real evidence of foul play. I mean, Maura Murray is just a complete mystery. She just vanishes off the face of the earth. Maybe she was picked up by somebody. Who knows? There are people who think her car is staged and it really didn't wreck there and all this other stuff. And none of it really makes sense if you look at the facts. In the Jason Landry case, there's a private investigator who the family has hired who thinks there was some sort of foul play involved. We don't agree with that, and we don't really see any evidence of it. Here, though, the fact that you have these two things together, the 11 miles and the 40 ignitions, when you put those together, and then the paint transfer, when you put those together, that's pretty good evidence that this accident happened somewhere else. It's still speculative. It's not solid. There may be ways to explain it away, but it would certainly make sense if the car was in a wreck somewhere else and wasn't on its side at the time. Then you could restart the vehicle. I don't know where you would go. I don't know what you would do with the car, but you can understand then how the 11 miles comes in. You can understand how the additional ignitions come in. You can understand how this paint transfer on the passenger side, front passenger side of this car comes in, and you can sort of see this not being a wreck in the middle of the desert, but a car being dumped in the desert. And there's more possible evidence of that we're going to talk about as we go.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the 40 ignition starts don't necessarily show you if the car was started. What we see is a potential 11 miles. And so it starts to seem a lot less strange if you have 40 ignition starts and they are to start the car and go somewhere. You park, you start it again, you go somewhere, you stop. you start the car again. I start and stop my car a dozen times throughout the day, if not more, to drive to work, to go to the store, to come home. And I stop my car each time and have to turn the ignition key, or so to speak, each time I restart my car. So the 40 number seems a lot more reasonable if you think that there's additional driving going on as well.
And remember, we talked about the rancher who found the car. And he says that he had been to that area a few days before and there was no SUV. And we have the police who flew over the area in a helicopter and they didn't see an SUV. We've said before, and we said on the last episode, that searches sometimes miss things, that you can walk right past things. Usually that's a body. This is an SUV. And I get it's dark colored, and so maybe you would miss it, but it doesn't look like anything else in the area. Maybe the rancher wasn't really exactly where he thought he was. Maybe the police in the helicopter weren't looking that hard. But you combine what the rancher says, you combine the helicopter, you combine the 11 miles, you combine the ignitions, you combine the red paint, you combine the lack of any trail leading up to where the car was found. You combine the fact that Daniel's father and the investigator have attempted to reconstruct what happened. And it just starts to feel really weird. And honestly, it makes me a little uncomfortable because I don't really like considering the possibility that this is something more than what it would appear to be from a, as Alice said, an Occam's razor approach, because usually it's not. Usually it is the most obvious thing. That is usually the answer. But in this case, we're just seeing all this weirdness. And I don't think we have enough here to say that this is more than just an accident in the desert where someone hit their head and wandered off and unfortunately probably perished. But it's worth looking into. I think that's kind of where I'm at as we start to walk through some of these strange things. And look, there was an investigation in this case. Now, it's evident that the police do not suspect foul play. They started a little late, as we talked about in the timeline. Daniel's dad is very critical of the police and what they did, but, I mean, they did do some investigation. But they also did some things that are kind of inexplicable. For instance, a day after they found the car, the police actually offered the vehicle back to David, to Daniel's father, and you kind of think, that's a little soon. That's a little soon to turn the car back over. Maybe you should hold on to that for a little bit longer just to make sure there isn't something nefarious going on. He actually asked the police to fingerprint the vehicle, and they did do that, and nothing of use was found. They also swabbed the inside driver's door handle, the steering wheel, the gear shifter, the start button, the rear view mirror, and the seatbelt for DNA. And these are all the things that if you get into a car, you might have touched, right? You adjust the mirror, you open the door, you put on your seatbelt, you push the button to start it, you put it in gear, put your hands on the steering wheel. These are places you would find DNA. If anything was found, we don't know about it. And it certainly isn't the case that the police have indicated that any unusual DNA was found. Now, from the police report that was prepared on September 23rd, 2021, it seems that the police believe that Daniel might have been delusional or even possibly suicidal when the accident occurred. But the weirdest thing the police did, and the thing that really makes me roll my eyes and wonder exactly who we're dealing with here, is they have suggested to Daniel's dad that it's possible he simply decided to leave and start a new life on his own. They compared him to a woman who left her family to become a nun. There is a monastery in the area. Daniel's dad even went there just to make sure that Daniel hadn't decided to become a priest or something. He obviously wasn't there, and there's no evidence to support any idea that Daniel just wandered off to start a new life without his wallet after crashing his car into the middle of the desert. And like I said, hearing that is troubling for a lot of reason.
Yeah, that's really troubling because obviously when you are part of the investigative team, you bat around all sorts of ideas, right? And so I can imagine this is discussed internally, but to say it to the victim's father, when obviously the family members have gone through something so tragic and they are hanging on every word from law enforcement because they are not in charge of the investigation. They want to know what happened to their loved ones, and it's very important how you say things and what you say to family members. And to suggest this with absolutely no evidence seems a bit of a strange step for the police in this case.
Like I said, it really makes you question what's going on here. And it's problematic because usually the police, the people who are investigating a case, really do have a much better idea of what's going on than any of us do. You know, we're sitting here on a podcast talking about cases, doing the best we can, but they really have that sort of first person involvement in the investigation. Just think back the Damien Hurd case that we did. I mean, you had a police department. They interviewed a whole lot of people. They wrote a 150-page report. It really feels like those guys, even though they were a small police department, they were doing their best. They did a good job. They brought Denver in to review their findings. It just makes you feel like you can have more faith and trust in their conclusions than you can, for instance, with this police department, who is going to tell a father, well, maybe your son just ran off to start a new life. That's the silly thing that conspiratorial people say. It's not the thing that serious investigators say when there's no evidence of it. And it certainly makes you think that any of this evidence we've talked about, they're not interested in doing the hard work of ruling it out. I mean, maybe it is a glitch, but prove it's a glitch. Give me a reason to believe that. You know, tell me where that paint came from. Explain to me the ignitions. At least try. Don't just say, well, maybe he ran off to become, a priest or whatever. Now, this investigation, other than this initial findings, really didn't reveal a whole lot, but there was an interesting find on the Sun Valley Parkway. Now, recall, you had the work site. You drove down the Sun Valley Parkway to get to the work site, and Daniel at some point leaves the work site. Rather than go left to go back to Sun Valley Parkway, he goes right off into the desert. Well, interestingly, the investigator actually found a sock on a roadway leading away from the job site back to the Sun Valley Parkway. So in the opposite direction that we believe Daniel went. And this sock matched one that was found in the vehicle. And it also matched other socks that were found in Daniel's apartment. Possible that's a coincidence? Feels like a pretty strange one. The weird thing about that is this sock is nowhere near where the wreck occurred. It's not in the direction that Daniel was traveling. How did it get there?
That's really interesting, Brett. Especially because, like we've talked about, there's not a bunch of traffic on these roadways. It's mostly the work site. So, maybe other guys, maybe everyone bought their socks from the same place because there's not a lot of places to shop. That could be possible. So much here is we're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle that could tell us a lot, right? Maybe it is that there's only, say, one Walmart in town and everyone bought their socks there because your socks get ruined out on the work site. It's very possible, but we don't have that information. So while this particular sock thing seems so strange to me, there's not enough there for me to say it's so strange it pushes me over to, some sort of conspiracy theory. But it is strange. I'll give you that. Let's talk about Daniel's love life. We know that in the weeks leading up to Daniel's disappearance, Daniel had met a girl, Caitlin, a woman. Now, Daniel worked as an Instacart deliverer on the side, and on June 12th, 2021, he delivered food to Caitlin's apartment. Caitlin and her roommate were having a good time, and they were drunk. So when an attractive, friendly Daniel showed up at their door, they invited him in to hang out. Caitlin and Daniel hit it off. They exchanged numbers, and Caitlin suggested a podcast he should listen to. After hanging out for a while, Daniel left. He'd forgotten something at her home, and a couple days later, he asked if he could come by and get it. Caitlin was out of town at the time, so she wasn't able to help Daniel with this. Daniel showed up at her apartment anyway, and she saw him on her security camera. She texted Daniel to let him know she wasn't around, but that she would arrange for him to pick up his stuff later. At this point, Daniel began to send texts to her that she described as, quote, creepy. These included heart emojis, texts saying that he was in love with her, and a text that he was outside her apartment. Caitlin did not understand why he would do this, as they'd only met briefly. This is really interesting because previously we had the relationship from the perspective of Daniel, which was that it was new and exciting and it was going really well. And then it ended suddenly. Here, from Caitlin's perspective, which is backed up by texts and security camera footage, it's a very different story than from Daniel's perspective. Instead of a sweet, exciting romance just starting, it sounds like they had a fun hangout. And then he started kind of jumping the gun and texting her things that were not reciprocated, but he kept doing so and making gestures like showing up her house when she had told him, basically, I'm not home. Don't come right now. But for him to go ahead and do it to essentially a stranger is a very different picture of this quote unquote relationship than we previously thought.
We're going to walk through some of the text messages, but it is really confusing exactly what kind of relationship they had. Daniel had told his dad that he had spent the night at her place, which, Daniel's dad chastised him for because he didn't know this person and he shouldn't be doing that. But then you hear from her side, and is she downplaying what happened? Did they have a relationship that went that far? Was it really just as ephemeral as she seems to say? There's a couple things that make you wonder on both sides. Now, Caitlin, she provided text messages to the police. They couldn't get them from Daniel's phone because it had been wiped. So the only place they had them was actually on Caitlin's phone. And look, they are strange. They start out entirely normal, and there's no reason to think anything unusual is going to follow up to about June 15th. The texts are about this forgotten item we talked about and the podcast that Caitlin had recommended to Daniel. Then suddenly on June 16th, Daniel sends the heart emoji that we mentioned. He then shows up at Caitlin's apartment unannounced and sends a text later in the night that simply says, I'm sorry. On June 17th, Caitlin texts him to say, please stop showing up unannounced. He says that he won't do it again, but then he texts that I couldn't stop thinking about you. She does not respond to this text. On Saturday the 19th, he asks at 12:44 p.m. if they can hang out. No response. On June 20th at 12:14 a.m., so essentially after midnight, the night of the 19th, he texts, I love you. That morning at 9:36 a.m., Caitlin texts, honestly, you showing up at my house unannounced made me extremely uncomfortable. I will not be home today, but I don't see us hanging out anytime soon. Dan responds, okay, but do you have any doubt? Either way, I'll have to be okay with your answer. She doesn't respond, and then at 3:46 p.m. the next day, Monday, June 21st, Daniel texts, I'm outside of your place.
Oof. Sorry, that gives me the creeps.
Yes. Yeah, and that leads to the following exchange. 6 question marks in a row. Please stop doing that. I'm not even home. This is not okay. Daniel, I guess it's not. Caitlin, not you guess. I've told you it is not okay and to not come to my home unannounced. Daniel, are you okay with me? Caitlin, no. This isn't normal nor acceptable. Daniel, what is normal? Caitlin, making plans before showing up at someone's home, and if someone has expressed that you've made them uncomfortable, you need to back off. Daniel, do you hate me? Caitlin, I don't hate you, but please leave me alone. The next day, Tuesday, June 22nd, Daniel texts, the world can get better, but I'll have to take all the time I can, or we can, whatever, to name it. I'll either see you again or never see you again. The next day, he disappears.
This is so hard because these text messages were provided by Caitlin, and I'm not saying she altered them in any way, but there's a reason that when we do investigative steps, we subpoena them from the source. So if you were to subpoena the records directly from the phone company, you could probably be able to tell things like, timestamps if it was the complete message, because your device can have certain messages deleted. So this is just interesting. So even when we get text messages turned over by a witness, if we are going to seriously consider using it, we often think about going to the source, which is the phone company, to subpoena all of the text messages or to ask for the device so that we can do forensics on the phone, because you can see if texts have been deleted or anything has been altered. Kind of the data tracks all those things. And it's not because we don't trust the witness, but you may have forgotten, like, oh, that text I tried to send through and it didn't go through, so I just deleted it so I could clear up my messages, that sort of thing. But here we just have it from Caitlin's perspective.
Yeah, and my understanding is Caitlin gave the police her phone for this purpose. Daniel's phone is wiped. Oftentimes, when it's just text, a lot of times phone companies keep those for a very short period of time. So probably by the time the police are looking at this, they've been wiped from that perspective. So you really only do have Caitlin's. To the extent the police can determine what she's deleted, I don't know. Caitlin will say that when Daniel came, that she and her roommate, they were there, they'd had a lot to drink. He seemed like a really nice guy. He seemed non-threatening. She invited him in. They then had a long conversation. They ended up talking about life. She tells him about this podcast he needs to listen to, which is sort of a philosophical podcast. Really unclear exactly what all happened that night and exactly how close they were. Now, the police will say, look, they weren't close at all. They basically had this one interaction, and then he leaves. They also will say that Daniel's dad said that he had fallen in love with a woman, and he told him that he didn't know anything about her. The problem with this is David, Daniel's father, says he never said that, and he doesn't know where the police got it. He says, as I said earlier, that he and David discussed their relationship, that they talked about deep conversations they'd had. They talked about this physical relationship that they had had, and that this podcast had really had an effect on him, and they talked about a lot of sort of philosophical things. And you just have to wonder, as Alice has said, the problem here is we really only have two people's perspective of what happened, but we don't have the full picture. So, if Daniel's telling the truth to his dad, then maybe this is a little less weird than it seems. Yes, he was doing things he shouldn't have done. He needs to listen to her when she says, don't show up at my place. But maybe he thinks they have a deeper, more meaningful, more serious relationship than they really do based on all these things that happened. The problem is, did any of those things happen? We just don't know what triggered what's going to happen that Wednesday. One possibility is that Daniel was having some sort of mental break, delusion. Something was going on with him, and this was part of it, and this is a symptom of it, and that everything he's telling his dad isn't true, that it's all in his mind. And I don't know. I mean, these text messages are really troubling, and I think when you just read them, they seem to point to something that's off.
Yeah, Brett. Either way, whichever perspective you take this from, Caitlin's perspective of the relationship or Daniel's perspective, this is a heightened level of angst, right? You don't use the words, do you hate me, lightly, typically in context, whether they are close or not. He is at a heightened level about this relationship. It is certainly affecting him in a way, whether it makes sense or not. It certainly seems to be affecting him in a way that is different than Caitlin. From these texts, at least, I see that Caitlin's just uncomfortable and trying to be very clear about what she wants, which is that she doesn't want him to bother her, and it's making her feel nervous. Whereas from his perspective, he's kind of asking questions that are internal focus, like, what does this do about me? It's not really about her. It's not about how she feels. It's more about, are you okay with me? What is normal? Am I normal? Do you hate me? All of his questions are very self-directed, which is very interesting and something that we see in mental illness, like delusional disorders or any sort of a schizophrenia, where you can't see outside of your perspective for that, period of time.
And I'll just point out, he met her on June 12th. He disappears on June 23rd. You know, a lot of this sort of weird interaction begins happening within days of him meeting her. So whatever happened between them, the things he's saying don't really match up with whatever level of relationship you could be at in that such a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, we've kind of been talking about this, but let's talk about Daniel's unusual behavior, because in addition to his interactions with Caitlin and his unusual behavior the day of his disappearance, his sister, Davisha, reported to police that Daniel had come to her apartment, sat down, and said nothing for 30 minutes. He then stood up and left without saying a word. Davisha also reported that David told her Caitlin had turned him on to a podcast that had changed the way he looked at life. He now sought positive energy while attempting to avoid negative energy.
I mean,
yeah.
I just don't even know what to say to that.
I know. Maybe this is in his normal behavior to come over and sit for 30 minutes and leave, but it doesn't seem like it, because he does seem to be an affable, this is a guy who was able to get a girl's number within the day of meeting her while doing her Instacart delivery. He doesn't seem like the person who would just sit for 30 minutes quietly. And I also think Davisha knows him very well. Obviously, this is his sister. They had like a code, for emergencies. And she thought this strange enough to report it as strange behavior. So we're taking it from her perspective that this is strange for him. And I think that is important, that this is not something he regularly does with or at Davisha's house. During the investigation, police became aware of a man named Roger. During one of the searches, Roger approached the family investigator and told him that he had something to tell him. Roger apparently seemed both terrified and distraught. But when the time came to speak to the investigator, Roger lost his nerve. A man named Roger was in Daniel's cell phone. Remember, it had been wiped except for contacts. Police spoke to Roger. He had been helping Daniel build a gaming computer and had had a meal with him on June 21st. He texted Daniel after he heard he'd gone missing, telling him that if he needed to talk to anyone, he was there for him. Daniel had lived with Roger and his girlfriend for about a month when Daniel first arrived in Phoenix, and Roger and Daniel worked together. On June 21st, Roger arrived at the office and was surprised to see Daniel, who very rarely came to the office. Roger was also shocked to see that Daniel had cut his hair off. This surprised him, as he had told him he wanted to grow his hair out. When Roger talked to Daniel, he was very different than his ordinary self, and it concerned Roger. Roger asked him if he could take him to breakfast and talk to him, but Daniel said no. Later, though, Daniel changed his mind. The two men went to Chick-fil-A, and Roger kept trying to get Daniel to talk to him, but it was to no avail. When Roger asked him what he wanted, Daniel said, "Whatever you're getting." This was also unusual, as Daniel always got spicy chicken nuggets.
And remember, this is June 21st. He's going to disappear on June 23rd. So they're out together. They're at Chick-fil-A. They're eating their food. Roger is pushing Daniel to open up to him. And he asks him if there's a problem with the girl. And Daniel admits yes. But he says the girl doesn't even know he exists. And at this point, Roger said that Daniel began saying some strange things. He asked him if he believed in miracles, and then he told Roger that he should start. Daniel talked about religion, he talked about God, which also surprised Roger, as he'd never heard him express any religious views before. Eventually, Daniel asked Roger if he trusted him. Then he told him that he had to get rid of his ego, because ego is bad. Roger told Daniel that he was not an egotistical person, but Daniel said that he needed to, quote, "get rid of my story." This also struck Roger, as Daniel was very proud of where he'd come from. Later, Roger saw Daniel with his favorite hat, a Miami Heat ball cap. Daniel said he should probably get rid of it, which also struck Roger as very strange. So that day, Daniel left carrying a box, but he didn't say goodbye to Roger. And Roger probably didn't think he would see him again anytime soon because Daniel worked in the field, not in the office. And yet, on the next morning, Roger gets to work, and there's Daniel back at the office. And he asks Roger if he wants to go to breakfast again. So they go off. And at that point, Daniel asks Roger what Roger would do if there was a girl he liked, but he couldn't have. And Roger said, look, man, if you want to ask her out, you need to ask her out and see what happens. Daniel at that point changed the subject, going back to talking about ego and talking about religion. And he indicated that he needed to change himself completely if he was going to have a shot with this girl.
That's really interesting in context with the text messages with Caitlin, because obviously Roger doesn't know the full context of what's going on with Caitlin. But, his advice that day is, well, if you like her, ask her out. And June 21st, remember, is when Daniel, after being told not to show up at Caitlin's house, out of the blue, texts her, I'm outside your place. So that actually helps to put things into context a little bit as to where that comes from, because they don't have a conversation before he texts, I'm outside your place. Maybe it was in a very strange response to what Roger said. And he's like, well, I got to take a step. Although I don't think that's what Roger told him to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, because it could explain that about why he did that.
But it also shows how maybe his thinking was a little disordered. In no way is Roger saying to show up at this girl's house. He just says to ask her out. And I think if you look at their text messages, it seems clear that Daniel had asked her out and she had said no. And I don't know that Roger necessarily knew that. His advice seems very generic. Sure, if you were to tell me you liked somebody, I'd be like, yeah, well, then just ask her out.
And I think that's a really good point. The disordered thinking and sort of some evidence of that going on here. I mean, look, the stuff that Daniel's doing with Caitlin seems really creepy, seems really inappropriate. Seems like the kind of thing that if one of your friends is doing that, you want to have an intervention with them. You want to stop them, or you don't want to be friends with them anymore. Everything that I have read and heard about Daniel is that he wasn't that kind of person. He wasn't the kind of person to be creepy and stalkerish. That just wasn't him. But you look at what's going on with Caitlin. You look at these conversations with Roger, the conversations about religion, all that strange stuff. You go back to some of the things we talked about in the timeline. Him showing up at Davisha's house for 30 minutes and not saying anything. Him sending her the emergency text. The text that he was supposed to send if there was an emergency, and then not responding to her phone calls. Him going to Waffle House and sort of acting strange there with this waitress who knew him, and he's acting very unusual and skittish. His friend, Ruben, you may recall, who called him and wanted to know places to visit in Arizona, and he just seems off. His other friend, Luke, who came to visit, and he seems depressed. These are interesting things that are going on with him. Even showing up at the Shell station and buying $3 worth of gas. This sort of, as Alice said, disordered thinking, just approaching things in a way that doesn't seem quite normal. Even when he gets to the job site and there's the storm coming through and he's there for 15 minutes and he's like, I'm going home, I'm going to bed. Even that is a little unusual. If you took everything else away, it's not necessarily unusual. He could just be tired because he was working late the night before. But when you combine it with everything else, it seems like doing something that only sort of makes sense in a very shallow way. And look, maybe doing something like driving 30 miles an hour into the side of a ravine because you think your car is going to be able to clear it and go over it, that might be a similar thing. Maybe when your car's laying on its side trying to restart it 30 times, even though it's literally laying on the passenger side, is another example of disordered thinking. When you combine what might already be a problem with a potential head injury, maybe that's how you get some of the weird things that we see.
Absolutely, Brett. I think we're starting to really put together the pieces of the puzzle, of the sparse pieces of puzzle that we have here, but I do think we're seeing kind of this pattern of the disordered thinking, that these factors and these situations seem strange unless you begin to see it through this kind of lens of disordered thinking. Now, let's wrap up these unusual circumstances with the remains, because during the search for Daniel, police have found 2 different sets of remains, neither of which belong to Daniel. This is a reminder of just how easy it is to disappear in a desert like this and how hard it can be to find a body. I mean, Brett, whoa. In searching for his body, they accidentally find 2 other bodies that they clearly weren't looking for, at least not in this location, which I think says a lot. And there are a lot of elements, harsh elements out there, the beating sun, dry dirt with animals and brush. A lot can happen out there, and also it's really hard to find a body. Maybe less so a car, like we've been talking about, but very hard to find a body.
And some of you will remember in the Gabby Petito case, this happened as well. When they were looking for her, they found several sets of remains that obviously did not belong to her. And look, it's hard. And in any wilderness area, it's not a great thing to think about, but there probably is a body out there of someone who went missing and was never found. Even though they have found no trace of Daniel, I don't think that tells you a whole lot, because people can often travel farther than you think. You have things like burrowing. I mean, this is a pretty sparse desert. There aren't a lot of places to hide, but it would not surprise me if Daniel went into that desert, and if unfortunately he passed away out there. It will not surprise me if he is eventually found, maybe in somewhere that's been searched before and you wonder how that happened, or in somewhere you never would have thought he would have been. And that's just something that happens. There are weird things about this case, but the fact that he has not been found is not something that surprises me. Well, look, there aren't a lot of facts in this case, but you've got basically everything we have, and that brings you down to the theories of what happened here, and they're really only 2. The first is, and I say there's only 2, the first is sort of a group theory, because we just don't have enough to nail it down to one aspect of this, but we'll just call it the foul play theory. There's a lot of different ways this could have gone down. Maybe Daniel was involved in an accident with someone who killed him in a rage, or maybe as he's driving through that desert, he comes upon a drug cartel that's moving drugs through the desert, and that ends up him losing his life. And then whoever did this sort of stages the accident to make it look like an accident, to make it look like somebody who just wandered off into the desert, and that's where we are. Now look, if you've listened to these 2 episodes, I think you probably, and you listen to our podcast, you're probably somebody who is a fan of the sort of cold water prosecutor's approach that we've done many times, where these kind of theories that are complex and involve some sort of conspiracy and everything else, very rare, very unlikely, probably didn't happen here. And I will agree with you on that. The one thing I will say, I would like there to be a little bit more investigation into some of the strange things that we've mentioned. Because if it is the case that this is an accident, maybe even an accident that came from some of the things we've talked about, Daniel's in a weird place, there is the possibility that Daniel, kind of like Blair Adams, you guys may remember that case, where Daniel is suffering some sort of mental break or psychosis, but that puts him in a position where he runs into the wrong person, possibly even literally runs into the wrong person, and that person does do some sort of harm to him. And so it's a combination of both. There are very strange things about this case that are difficult to explain, and they're difficult to explain away. They may be red herrings, but it is perfectly possible, for instance, that Daniel got into a wreck with someone and then just drove off, right? We talked about the red paint transfer. It's possible he did hit somebody, but it didn't result in any kind of interaction. Might have been a parked car for all we know, and he just drove away, and we just have no idea that happened. That's a possibility that would explain the paint, for instance. But we don't know that for sure. And then you combine that with the ignitions, which maybe you can say, well, the ignitions could be explained by he's got some sort of issues, obviously this disordered thinking. Well, then you've got the 11 miles. And when you combine all those things together, you can explain them away. And maybe that is right. Maybe these are all just sort of a strange group of coincidences that are all independent of each other and independently explainable. But I would like the police to do just a little bit more investigation to sort of convince me that there's nothing unusual going on here before I can just dismiss out of hand the idea that this is foul play.
And Brett, I think, I'm always in favor of learning more, researching more, investigating more. But with what we have so far here, and the police did do an investigation here, even if it took maybe a little bit of prodding by Daniel's father, but I do think they did an investigation here. And with what we have, I think that the other theory that you were talking about, if it's not foul play, would be that Daniel was involved in a single car accident and then ran off into the desert, took off his clothes or something like that. I don't think he perished in that car. Nor do I actually think that was the first wreck that he was in. But I tend to lean towards this with what we know, because we're beginning to see multiple people talk about this sort of strange behavior that was strange for Daniel. People who knew him well and people who didn't know him well, who described this type of disordered thinking that we've begun to explore. His sister, Davisha, who knew him very well, had him acting very strangely in the days leading up to his disappearance. Two people he worked closely with, even if they weren't close. The fact that you're at a work site together, he lived with one of them, with Roger, for a month while he was getting set up at the new work site. You at least had a familiarity where these two people were able to at least think, Daniel is acting strange today for Daniel. And then you have the friends who don't know anything about his life in terms of where he lives in the worksite, who are outside of his immediate situation, seeing into his life at a certain point and recognizing that there is something strange going on for Daniel. Again, these are all people who have a baseline with which to judge Daniel's behavior at this time, and it all seems to be in a very short amount of time. Of course, it's possible that this had been happening for some time, but because he was off-site, it took longer for it to be put together. But I do find it significant that so many different witnesses, Davisha, Caitlin, three friends who he was in contact with, either because they were visiting or they were calling him in the week before his disappearance, and two friends, or at least acquaintances, at his work. So about at least seven different witnesses who have no reason to lie are telling a pretty consistent picture of Daniel in the short days leading up to his disappearance, which is not his usual self. And so that would be subjective, but then objectively doing things that are strange, like showing up at a girl's house when she has asked him specifically not to show up, and to change his entire outlook of life in a very short span of time. All of a sudden saying, wanting to get rid of his favorite possessions, saying that, calling himself egotistical, and saying he needs to change everything about himself for there to be a better world. Sounds like a potential next step, even if it's disordered thinking, to, if I'm going to start a new life, it needs to start now. And it needs to start without all my worldly possessions, my computers, my phones. I need to wipe my phone because it is a history keeper of everything I used to be, and I need to erase all that about me. He said those words to Roger, that I need to, get rid of these parts of me to become anew. And again, the taking off the clothes, that may have been him, quite literally stripping himself of his old self, all part of this disordered thinking. And when you are, not wearing any clothes, with no protection from the elements, no phone, no computer to contact anyone, you probably, especially if you're not thinking clearly from, say, head trauma and a potential mental issue that's percolating at this time, it could very easily make you a very vulnerable person to the elements, to just not be able to make it in the elements with no protection, and to essentially die from natural causes, even if the things leading up to it seemed very unnatural, but were all behavioral and internal to Daniel.
I think that's a very good description of probably what happened here. We can only really speculate about what happened that day. It's possible that Daniel really was going to drive back to Phoenix, and he took a wrong turn, leaving a work site that he'd never been to before, and he ended up trying to find his way back, but he ends up in the desert. Another possibility is not that he disappeared to start a new life, but that he was trying to, like so many people before him, sort of go into the desert to, as you said, shed these sort of worldly things that were holding him back, and that the wreck, combined with maybe hitting his head and this disordered thinking, did make him think, I'll just take my clothes off and wander into the desert, and I'll come back, a new man. I mean, it's really impossible to say what happened that day. I think the most likely outcome here is this is some sort of accident, some sort of tragic accident that really came from a place of mental illness, an undiagnosed mental illness, some sort of psychotic break. I'm not exactly sure what. Doesn't seem like he had any history of it, but as we know, it can come on suddenly, particularly between about 17 and 25. And we don't know what happened here. I hope one day we do know, but I think this case is worthy of a little bit more investigation to just nail down a few things. I think Daniel's family absolutely deserves more answers in this case. And no matter what happened, whether it's foul play or it's an accident, we need to find Daniel. If you're in Arizona, if you're in the area, there are searches ongoing even as we speak. Daniel's dad leads a lot of those searches. We are going to put a link to the GoFundMe page where you can contribute to a lot of these searches. They have raised a ton of money, but it is an expensive thing when you have been searching for your son by the time this comes out for almost a year. So if you can support that, do so. We're going to make a donation to that as well. Just want to remind you guys, Daniel is described as a 5'8" black man weighing 165 pounds with black hair, brown eyes, and is missing part of his right forearm, including his hand. There is a $10,000 reward being offered by the family for information that can bring him home. If you have any information, go to pleasehelpfinddaniel.com or call a tip line at 844-602-0660. And if you go to our website, we will have both of those contact numbers on the site. We were honored to talk to Daniel's dad, and we hope with all our hearts that he is able to find some answers about what happened to his son. We want to hear from you guys what you think about this case. prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on all our social media. Join the discussion that's ongoing in the gallery about this case, or go to our subreddit where you can talk about this case as well. If you're watching on YouTube, hello. And hello to all of you who are hearing this episode early and ad-free on our Patreon page. Well, Alice, do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off?
Just how sad this is for his family, because Daniel, we've talked a lot about the days leading up to his disappearance, but I mean, he is an impressive young man who really has had the world in front of him. And whatever the reason is for his disappearance, whatever led up to, the days we were talking about, they don't define who he was. He had accomplished so much in his short life, and that's why this is such a tragedy. So this was a sad case to see. I do hope that the family gets more answers for Daniel and for them.
Very well said, Alice, and very, very true. Okay, guys, we will be back next week with a new case, new questions, and hopefully some new answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
If that means the quality increases or decreases.
I think we decided the quality increases.
I think so. So maybe from now on, we only record after 10 p.m.
Of course, I don't actually remember anything we said in the last episode. So I'm just going to have to work with what I got. Got to work with what I got.
Oh, you're so good.
Okay. All right. Here we go.
I don't know, you probably already know this, but you sound more tipsy tonight than last night, or whatever. So I think you are a very good drunk.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I got one.
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go.